Most people believe my son died from a sudden heart attack, but I know it was the gravy. 1 year ago, at our Thanksgiving table, he asked me to taste the special sauce he supposedly made. It smelled faint and metallic. I switched plates with his wife to be polite, and that simple act turned me into a homeless widow and her into a murderer. Now I am going to use every cent I have to make sure she pays. My name is Eleanor Briggs. I am 68 years old, and today I buried my only son. The cheap motel room smells of stale cigarette smoke and industrial cleaner, a scent that clings to the back of my throat. But it is nothing compared to the crushing weight in my chest. I sit on the edge of the sagging mattress, counting my own heartbeats. 1, 2, 3. They are steady, unlike Matthew's. His heart stopped 2 days ago in the garage he loved so much, silenced by what the coroner called a massive cardiac event. But as I stare at the peeling beige wallpaper, my mind does not stay in the morgue. It drifts back exactly 1 year to the day the nightmare truly began. It goes back to Thanksgiving. The house in Maple Ridge, Ohio, was filled with the artificial warmth of the furnace and the genuine laughter of family. It felt safe then. We were all gathered around the oak table when Matthew walked in from the kitchen, holding a porcelain gravy boat with a pride I had rarely seen on his face. He announced that he had made the gravy himself this year. The whole table erupted in good-natured teasing. My Matthew, a man who could take apart a transmission with his eyes closed but burned toast if he stared at it too long, had cooked nothing in his life. He just laughed it off, insisting he wanted to try something new. That was when I saw it. It was a fleeting look. A micro-expression passed between Matthew and his wife. Tara. She was sitting across from him, her eyes fixed on the gravy boat with an intensity that did not match the festive mood. It was a silence that screamed, the kind only an old woman who has spent decades reading people would notice. Matthew moved to my side of the table. He ladled a generous amount of the thick brown sauce over my turkey and mashed potatoes. He leaned down, his voice trembling slightly as he said, "Mum, try this special gravy I made, just for you." The steam rose up, carrying a scent that made the hair on my arms stand up. Beneath the sage and onion, there was a faint, metallic tang. It was bitter and sharp, like the smell of old pennies or the rat bait my late husband used to keep in the shed. Panic flared in my gut, but I looked at my son's eager face and could not bring myself to scream. Instead, I feigned a clumsy spill. I bumped the table leg with my knee and quickly switched my plate with Tara's, apologizing profusely that I had placed mine too close to my wine glass. Tara rolled her eyes, but took a bite of the turkey from the plate that was meant for me. 5 minutes later, chaos erupted. Tara's face turned a violent shade of crimson. She clawed at her throat, gasping for air as hives bloomed across her neck. We rushed her to the emergency room, terrified. The doctor later told us she had suffered a severe allergic reaction to almond extract used in the broth. Everyone breathed a sigh of relief, blaming it on Matthew's culinary incompetence. But I sat in that hospital waiting room, remembering the metallic smell, and I knew there were no almonds in that gravy. Cut to today. The sky over the cemetery was the colour of a bruised lung, dropping wet, grey snow onto the fresh dirt. I stood there, shaking in my wool coat, staring at the mahogany casket that held my boy. The wind bit at my exposed skin, but the cold radiating from my daughter-in-law was far worse. Tara stood next to me, not in widow's weeds, but in a sleek, fashionable black coat that hugged her waist. Her nails were painted a blood red that looked violent against the snow. She did not cry. She kept checking her gold wristwatch, shifting her weight from foot to foot, as if the funeral were a boring meeting she was desperate to leave. As the priest finished his final prayer and the first shovel of earth hit the wood with a hollow thud, Tara leaned in close to me. I thought she was going to offer a word of comfort. Instead, her breath was hot against my ear as she whispered, "You have 30 days to get out of my house." She pulled back, her face composed into a mask of tragic grief for the onlookers, leaving me standing there with the realization that the war had not ended with the gravy. It had only just begun. The ride back to the house on Elm Street was silent. When we arrived, the mourning widow act vanished before the front door even clicked shut. Tara disappeared into the master bedroom and emerged 5 minutes later. She had stripped off her black funeral dress and replaced it with a tight red cashmere sweater that looked like a fresh wound against the drab living room walls. She walked into the kitchen where I was making tea and did not offer to help. Instead, she opened the junk drawer, pulled out a folded stack of documents, and slapped them onto the dining table with a sound like a gunshot. She told me to sit down. Her voice was ice cold. She explained that Matthew had been drowning in debt that he kept secret from me. She claimed that to save her from his financial ruin, he had signed the house over to her 2 weeks before his heart stopped. It was the only asset she had left, she said, and she needed to liquidate it to pay off his creditors. I reached into my purse and put on my reading glasses. The document was a quitclaim deed, standard and impersonal. My eyes went straight to the bottom of the page. The signature read, Matthew Briggs, but the ink looked hesitant. The capital M was too looped, and the B lacked the sharp, aggressive downstroke my son always used. I traced the line with my finger. I whispered that he never signed his name like this. It looked like someone had tried to copy it while their hand was shaking. Tara snatched the paper back. She sneered and called me a senile old woman who was seeing things. She leaned across the table, invading my personal space, and delivered her ultimatum. She told me I had 30 days to vacate the premises. If I was not gone by then, she would call the sheriff and have me arrested for trespassing on her private property. She expected me to beg. She waited for the tears, the pleading, the invocation of family loyalty. But I felt a strange calm settle over me, the kind of calm that comes before a storm breaks. I did not cry. I simply folded my hands on the table and looked her in the eye. I told her quietly that I did not need 30 days. The confusion on her face was satisfying, but I did not linger to enjoy it. I stood up and walked to the guest room that had been my home for the last 5 years. I opened the closet door and reached to the top shelf. There, tucked behind a stack of old quilts, was a silver blue duffel bag. I had packed it 6 months ago. Inside were 3 changes of clothes, my toiletries, and a thick, leather-bound notebook. I had been ready to leave for a long time. I was just waiting for the right reason. I carried the bag into the living room. I paused by the old recliner that had belonged to my late husband. Jack. The velvet was worn smooth on the arms. I rested my hand there for a second, feeling the ghost of him. I could hear his voice clearly in my head. He always told me not to let anyone know what I held in my hand, not even our own son, until I was sure they had chosen the right side. Matthew had been weak, but he had been my son. Tara was something else entirely. I walked to the front door and opened it. letting the winter chill bite into the warm hallway. I turned back to look at her one last time. She was standing by the fireplace, arms crossed, looking triumphant. I told her that she had just chosen her side. Then I stepped out and closed the door firmly behind me. An hour later, I stood at the reception desk of a budget motel near the interstate trucking depot. The neon sign outside buzzed with a dying flicker. When the clerk asked for payment, I did not reach for the joint checking account I shared with Matthew, which I knew Tara would drain by morning. I pulled out a black credit card that I had kept hidden in the lining of my purse. The name embossed on the plastic was not Eleanor Briggs. It read, Harborview Storage and Logistics, LLC. The clerk swiped it without a second glance, having no idea that the old woman in the cheap coat was not the destitute widow she appeared to be. The next morning, I took a cab to the centre of Harborview. The obsidian tower rose 70 stories into the grey sky, a monolith of steel and glass that made the pedestrians below look like ants. I walked past the security desk with my head held high and took the express elevator to the 32nd floor. The receptionist nodded at me, but I walked straight past her to the corner office where Naomi Clark was waiting. Naomi was a striking woman in her early 40s, with a mane of wild curly hair and eyes that could cut glass. When she saw me, she did not offer a formal handshake. She came around her massive desk and hugged me tight. She called me Ms. Briggs. But the affection in her voice was that of a daughter. 20 years ago, she had been a scrappy intern with too much ambition and no money. I was the one who saw her potential and quietly paid her law school tuition when her own family wrote her off. We sat down, and the city sprawled out beneath us in a grid of grey and white. To the world, I was Eleanor Briggs, the retired secretary who clipped coupons and drove a 10-year-old sedan. They saw the polyester pants and the sensible shoes. They did not see the 40 years of strategy. While my husband Jack drove trucks for a living, I had used my clerical wages to buy what nobody else wanted. I bought condemned row houses, gravel parking lots, and abandoned warehouses near the dying shipping docks. I bought them for pennies. Now, those properties were the logistical arteries of the city. When Jack died, Naomi helped me lock it all away. We created the Briggs Heritage Trust. Every single asset, from the house in Maple Ridge to a 40% stake in North Line Freight Systems, was owned by the trust. It was an ironclad fortress designed to survive lawsuits, bad marriages, and death. Naomi slid a manila folder across the polished mahogany. It contained a high-resolution scan of the quitclaim deed Tara had slapped on my table the day before. Naomi tapped the signature with a manicured fingernail. She told me that Tara's lawyer had submitted this to the county recorder yesterday morning. But Naomi's team had already pulled the digital metadata. The document had been scanned and saved on a computer 3 weeks before Matthew died. Then she flipped the page to a forensic report. The expert analysis was brutal. It flagged the signature as a crude tracing, likely done by placing a light source under a real signature and copying the lines. The expert called it amateur level. Naomi leaned back in her leather chair and gave me a grim smile. She told me the forgery was actually the least of Tara's problems. She explained that even if Matthew had signed that paper with a clear head and a steady hand, it would be worth less than the paper it was printed on. Matthew could not give away the house because he never owned it. The title to the property on Elm Street had been transferred to the trust 10 years ago. As the trustee, only Naomi had the legal authority to sign over the deed. Matthew was merely a beneficiary with residency rights. He had zero power to sell, transfer, or encumber a single brick of that house. A wave of nausea and relief washed over me. My son had not betrayed me. He had not secretly signed away our home to pay off her debts. But then the guilt hit me, sharp and cold. I realized that by hiding the true extent of my wealth, I might have inadvertently killed him. Tara saw a struggling mechanic with a house she could flip for a quick payout. If she had known about the trust, about the millions in assets I controlled, she might have played a different game, or she might have killed us both sooner. Naomi watched my face, reading the silence perfectly. She outlined our next move. We were not just going to defend the house. We were going to go on the offensive. She proposed filing an immediate eviction notice against Tara for trespassing on trust property, coupled with a criminal complaint for document forgery. But that was just the start. Naomi said it was time to go to the district attorney. We were going to formally request that the coroner reopen the investigation into Matthew's death, citing the forgery as evidence of a financial motive for homicide. I nodded, feeling the grief harden into something useful. Naomi closed the folder with a sharp snap that echoed in the quiet office. She looked out at the skyline, her expression fierce. She said that Tara thought she was fighting a lonely old woman for a rundown house. She had no idea she had just walked into a hidden empire she did not even understand. The following morning, Tara moved through the hallways of the Maple Ridge house with the relaxed air of a woman who believed she had finally won. She held a steaming latte in one hand, the ceramic mug warming her palms as she surveyed the living room. In her mind, the dated floral wallpaper was already gone, replaced by modern grey paint and minimalist art. She was on the phone with a real estate agent from Bright Nest Realty, discussing the listing price for what she called her newly inherited asset. She spoke loudly about tearing down the wall between the kitchen and the dining room to create an open concept flow, laughing as she described the old furniture she planned to have hauled away by the weekend. The conversation was cut short by a heavy, authoritative pounding on the front door. It was not the polite knock of a neighbour delivering a casserole or offering condolences. It was the sound of someone who did not need to ask for permission to enter. Tara frowned, annoyed at the interruption. She told the agent she had to go and hung up. She smoothed her hair, checked her reflection in the hallway mirror, and prepared to accept another sympathy bouquet. When she opened the door, her smile faltered. Standing on the porch were two uniformed officers from the Harborview Police Department. Sergeant Black was a middle-aged woman with sharp, observant eyes that seemed to dissect Tara instantly. Beside her stood Officer Lucas, younger but equally grim. Neither of them looked like they were there to offer comfort to a grieving widow. Sergeant Black wasted no time. She informed Tara that they had received a formal complaint from the Briggs Heritage Trust regarding the unauthorized trespassing and illegal occupation of the property. She asked Tara to step aside so they could verify the occupancy status. Tara immediately launched into her performance. She pressed a hand to her chest, her lower lip trembling just enough to suggest fragility. She told the officers that this was a mistake, a cruel harassment campaign by her bitter mother-in-law. She claimed Eleanor was a vindictive woman who hated her because she came from a poor background, spinning a tale of class discrimination and family cruelty. She dabbed at dry eyes, waiting for the officers to soften, to apologize, to take her side against the mean old lady. Sergeant Black did not blink. She kept her tone neutral and professional as she pulled a file from under her arm. She read aloud a case number, stating that the department had received a request to reopen the investigation into the death of Matthew Briggs. She emphasized the words financial motive and document forgery. She explained that new evidence suggested the cardiac event might not have been natural and that the deceased may have been under duress regarding his assets. The blood drained from Tara's face. The words investigation and financial motive hit her like a physical blow. For a split second, the porch and the police officers vanished, replaced by a terrifying montage of memories. She saw the bottle of rat poison hidden behind the bleach in the laundry room. She remembered the specific, bitter smell of the gravy on Thanksgiving. She recalled the countless cups of coffee she had lovingly prepared for Matthew over the last few months, watching him drink them while she smiled. A cold sweat broke out along her spine. The officers did not arrest her then and there. Sergeant Black simply issued a warning. She stated that the house was now considered a disputed asset in an active criminal investigation. Tara was forbidden from selling, transferring, or altering the property in any way. Any attempt to list the house with a realtor would be considered tampering with evidence. They told her to expect further questioning and advised her not to leave the city. When the heavy wooden door finally clicked shut, the facade Tara had built crumbled completely. She leaned back against the wood and slid down until she hit the floor, her legs no longer able to support her weight. She gripped her knees, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She had thought Eleanor was just a powerless, senile old woman she could bully into submission. She realized now, with a dawn of horror, that she was wrong. Eleanor was not helpless. She was the face of a massive, unseen legal machine that was slowly grinding into gear. Tara's phone buzzed in her pocket, making her jump. She pulled it out with trembling fingers. The screen lit up with a string of missed calls from numbers she did not have saved. But she knew exactly who they were. The debts were due. The interest was compounding. And now, the house she had counted on to save her was locked inside a legal cage. She sat alone in the hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on her, feeling the invisible noose beginning to tighten. I sat in the oversized black leather chair in the corner of the conference room on the 32nd floor, my hands resting on the polished handle of my wooden cane. Through the floor-to-ceiling glass, the city of Harborview looked like a complex circuit board of grey steel and moving lights. From up here, the people were invisible, and the noise was non-existent. It was just a game of strategy, much like the one I was about to play. The heavy oak doors opened 5 minutes past the scheduled time. Tara walked in, flanked by her lawyer, a man named Dylan Marks, who wore a suit that cost more than my first car and a smile that did not reach his eyes. They sat opposite us. Dylan did not waste time with pleasantries. He opened his briefcase and launched into a rehearsed speech about the victimization of his client. He called me a bitter woman who was using her age and her meager savings to harass a grieving widow. He looked at Naomi and then at me, insinuating that my actions were driven by a deep-seated bias against Tara's background, painting me as a classist monster who simply wanted to see her daughter-in-law on the street. Tara played her part perfectly. She dabbed at dry eyes with a tissue, her voice trembling as she told the room that I had never accepted her. She said I always looked at her as a gold digger. She claimed Matthew knew how cruel I was, which was why he signed the house over to her. She insisted he wanted to protect her from poverty because he knew I would leave her with nothing. Naomi waited for them to finish. She did not interrupt. She simply sat there with a calmness that unnerved Dylan. When the room finally fell silent, Naomi slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was the forensic handwriting analysis. Her voice was sharp and precise, as she pointed out the microscopic tremors in the signature on the deed Tara had produced. She noted the unnatural pauses in the ink flow where the pen had lifted. She used words like forgery and felony with a casual weight that made Dylan loosen his tie. Tara went pale, her eyes darting between the paper and her lawyer. Then Naomi placed a thick, leather-bound binder on the table. The gold letters on the cover read, Briggs Heritage Trust. She opened it and explained the reality of the situation. She told them that, legally, Eleanor Briggs owned nothing but the clothes on her back and a checking account with a few $100s in it. Every piece of real estate, every commercial warehouse, and specifically the house in Maple Ridge, belonged to the trust. Dylan snatched the binder. He flipped through the pages frantically. His eyes scanned the dates, and I saw the moment the realization hit him. The transfer of the house to the trust had been recorded 10 years ago. Sweat began to bead on his forehead. He knew that you cannot give away what you do not own. The quitclaim deed Tara had forged was not just a crime. It was a legal impossibility. I decided it was time to speak. I kept my voice low and steady. I told them about the nights Jack and I spent driving trucks and loading crates. I spoke of the weekends we spent fixing up condemned properties that no one else wanted to touch. I told them that in 40 years, we never borrowed a single cent from Matthew or anyone else. We built this brick by brick. It was not a complaint. It was a statement of fact. Tara lost her composure. She stood up, her chair scraping loudly against the floor. She screamed that I was a liar. She called me a poor, stingy old hag who was making up this trust nonsense to steal her home. Her mask of the victim slipped, revealing the sneering contempt she had always held for what she thought was my working-class poverty. She could not reconcile the woman she saw in cheap polyester pants with the empire in that binder. Naomi closed the meeting with a question that cut through the noise. She said we had no intention of using force to remove her, as the law was already on our side. She looked directly at Tara and asked why she was so desperate to forge a document immediately after her husband died unexpectedly. She asked what pushed her to commit a felony before the body was even cold. Tara grabbed her purse and fled the room, looking like a trapped animal. Dylan followed her, muttering apologies. I remained in my chair, looking out at the city view. I did not feel triumphant. I felt a cold knot of suspicion tightening in my stomach. If this was just about greed, just about securing a house, why did the desperation start so soon? My mind drifted back to the Thanksgiving dinner 1 year ago, to the metallic taste of the gravy. It started there? I knew I had to find out why. Naomi introduced me to a man named Luis Ortega. He looked like he had lived a few lifetimes already. A man in his 50s with tired skin, but eyes that were alert and sharp. He wore a worn leather jacket that smelled faintly of old tobacco and rain. Naomi told me he used to be a financial crimes investigator for the state police before he got sick of the system protecting the wrong people and walked away. He did not offer a handshake. He just sat down, opened a small notepad, and asked me to talk. I told him everything. I recounted the Thanksgiving dinner in vivid detail, focusing on the metallic taste of the gravy that everyone else had dismissed. I told him about the sudden change in Tara's behavior over the last year, how she insisted on making Matthew's coffee every morning and preparing those green smoothies she claimed were good for his heart. I told him about the strange fatigue Matthew complained about, the bruises that wouldn't heal, and how Tara always waved it off as overwork. Luis listened without interrupting. When I finished, he tapped his pen against the pad. He said that Tara's story about Matthew being in debt did not make sense. Matthew ran a successful garage with steady cash flow. Men like that do not usually hide massive debts without showing signs of stress. Luis said he was betting the debt wasn't his. He was going to look for hers. It took him 48 hours to follow the digital money trail. He started with a secondary email address Tara used for coupon apps and found it linked to half a dozen offshore gambling sites. She was into sports betting and online poker, and she was terrible at it. Luis found transfers from digital wallets that drained their joint savings account dry in small, unnoticed increments of $50 or $100. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. The real problem was a name Luis found in a digital ledger associated with a known associate of the Silver Creek Casino in the neighboring state. The name was Mason Reddick, a loan shark who preyed on desperate gamblers. Luis told us that Tara owed Reddick over $200,000. The interest rates were predatory, the kind that meant you never actually paid off the principal. Then Luis laid out the timeline of her desperation. He found records of 3 separate applications for a home equity line of credit on the Maple Ridge house. All 3 were submitted in the last 6 months. All 3 bore Matthew's signature, which we now knew was forged. And all 3 were rejected instantly because the bank's title search showed the owner was the Briggs Heritage Trust, not Matthew Briggs. She had been trying to mortgage a house she didn't own to pay a debt she couldn't handle. But the piece of evidence that made the room go cold was a recovered text message. Luis had managed to pull data from an old phone Tara had traded in at a repair kiosk downtown. He found a thread with a burner number linked to Reddick's operation. The message was sent 3 weeks before Matthew died. It read simply, "Stop pushing me. By the end of the month, the house will be in my name and you will get your cash. He won't be a problem by then." Luis looked at me, his expression grave. He explained that Tara was out of options. With a debt of $200,000 and a violent man like Reddick demanding payment, she had to make a choice. She could pay with money she didn't have. She could pay with her life, or she could trade someone else's life for the assets she needed. I gripped the handle of my cane until my knuckles turned white. I did not cry. The sadness was gone, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. I looked Luis in the eye and asked him if he could prove that this intent started before the heart attack. I needed him to link that debt to the gravy. Luis nodded slowly. He said he was going to overlay the timeline of her gambling losses with Matthew's medical history. He promised he would find the exact moment when her debt became my son's death sentence. Luis dug into the digital footprint of my son's life with a terrifying efficiency. He pulled up Matthew's cell phone records on his monitor, scrolling through months of data until he stopped at a cluster of calls made 3 weeks after that fateful Thanksgiving. They were all directed to a number in the financial district. Luis ran the number and whistled low. It belonged to Harper and Lowell, a high-end law firm specializing in family law and estate planning. We drove to their office immediately. It was less flashy than Naomi's tower, filled with old wood and the smell of serious money. Megan Harper was a sharp young attorney who initially tried to block us with client privilege. But when Naomi laid out the reality of the situation, the Briggs Heritage Trust, the forged deed, and the fact that this was now a homicide investigation, Megan's professional resolve shifted. She went to a wall safe behind her desk and pulled out a thick file. She told us that Matthew had come to her in a state of panic. He had found a piece of notebook paper in the trash bin of his home office. It was covered in attempts to copy his signature. He told Megan he suspected Tara was planning to take the house from under him. He was shaking when he signed the retainer. Megan opened the file and spread the documents out. There was a petition for divorce, drafted and ready to be filed. But more importantly, there was a new will. In this document, Matthew explicitly stated that his auto repair shop, his Ford truck, and his personal savings account were to be bequeathed entirely to me. Tara was specifically named and disinherited from receiving a single penny. It was the final piece of the motive puzzle. If Matthew filed for divorce, Tara got nothing due to the debts. If he died without a will, she would inherit everything as the surviving spouse. But with this will, she was left with only her gambling debts and the loan shark waiting at her door. Then Megan looked at me with sympathy in her eyes and told me something that made the room spin. She said Matthew had hesitated to sign at the last minute because he was afraid. He told her that he did not think Tara would physically hurt him, but he couldn't shake the memory of Thanksgiving. He said to Megan, "Mum got sick after dinner, but she didn't eat the gravy. Tara ate it and almost died. If she put something in Mum's food, who is to stop her from doing it to me?" I felt a cold shiver run down my spine. My son had known, or at least, he had suspected enough to be terrified. Luis wanted more. He remembered Matthew mentioning a simple camera system he had installed to keep an eye on his retriever, Buster, while he was at work. Luis obtained a warrant for the cloud storage account linked to Matthew's email. We sat in the silence of Luis's office as he pulled up the footage dated November 24th of last year. The video was clear. It showed the kitchen of the Maple Ridge house. Tara was standing at the stove, stirring a pot. She paused and looked over her shoulder, checking the empty hallway. Her body language was tight, nervous. She reached into the pocket of her apron and pulled out a small, folded paper packet. She dumped a white powder into the simmering gravy and stirred it vigorously. She threw the paper into the trash compactor. 2 minutes later, Matthew walked into the frame. He hugged her from behind and kissed her cheek. She smiled at him, the perfect picture of a loving wife, while the poisoned gravy bubbled inches away. Luis switched the file to the dining room camera. The angle was high, capturing the entire table. We watched the scene play out again, but this time with the horrific context of truth. Matthew ladled the gravy onto my plate. He sat down. Then, the camera caught what the human eye had missed in the moment. I bumped the table leg. I apologized. And with a quick, fluid motion, I switched my plate with Tara's. The silence in the room was deafening. I had unknowingly handed the poison back to the assassin. Luis paused the video and pointed at the screen. He said that the reaction Tara suffered that night was not an allergy. It was a reaction to a mild dose of whatever toxin she had intended for me, likely rat poison or a blood thinner. When that failed, and when she realized Matthew was meeting with lawyers, she changed her strategy. She switched from a single lethal dose for me to a slow, cumulative poisoning for him. I stared at the frozen image of the plate switch. I cried without making a sound. My son had died protecting me with legal papers he never got the chance to file. He had died because I had survived. I wiped the tears from my face and looked at Naomi. I told her that we were going to make sure that his last will and testament was not just a piece of paper. It was going to be the hammer that nailed her coffin shut. The news that the county coroner was exhuming Matthew's body leaked to the local press like oil into water. It was messy, spreading fast and staining everything it touched. I imagined Tara's lawyer, Dylan Marks, told her to lock her doors and keep her mouth shut. He probably told her that the situation was volatile and that silence was her only shield. But silence requires discipline, and Tara was running on panic and narcissism. She was terrified of going to prison, but she was even more terrified of losing the adoration of the public. So, she did what desperate people with a smartphone and a victim complex do. She called CityView Live. CityView Live was a primetime talk show that thrived on outrage. They loved stories about the little guy getting crushed by the system, and Tara served herself up on a silver platter. I sat in my hotel room, the curtains drawn against the city lights, and watched the performance. The studio lights were bright white, designed to wash out imperfections. Tara sat on a beige sofa, looking smaller than I had ever seen her. Gone were the sharp red nails and the tight designer clothes. She wore a simple, oversized white button-down shirt and had pulled her hair back into a messy, humble bun. She looked like the archetype of the all-American grieving widow. She looked like a saint. The host leaned in with practiced empathy and asked her how she was coping. Tara let a single tear roll down her cheek before she started her script. She described me not as a mother who had lost a son, but as a bitter, brown-skinned tyrant who had never accepted her because she came from nothing. She painted a picture of a class war where she was the casualty. She told the camera that I had thrown her out of her own home the day after the funeral, describing it as a ruthless attack motivated by greed. Then she went for the jugular. She looked directly into the lens and claimed that I was using a powerful network of high-priced minority lawyers to strip her of her rights. She tossed out keywords like wealthy elite and systemic bias, knowing exactly which buttons to push to ignite the internet's fury. The screen split, showing a grainy, out-of-context clip of me leaving the house with my duffel bag and cane. The caption beneath it read, "Secret millionaire mother-in-law evicts grieving widow." In that 10-second clip, I wasn't a woman walking away from abuse. I was a villain counting her gold. I felt the bile rise in my throat, but the worst was yet to come. The host asked about the rumors surrounding Thanksgiving. Tara nodded solemnly. She twisted the memory until it snapped. She told the audience that I had tried to choke her. She claimed that I had forced her to eat a dish I knew she hated, implying that I had tried to harm her. She completely omitted the part where she almost died from poison. Meant for me. She omitted the metallic taste. She turned her attempted murder into my act of bullying. I wanted to throw the remote at the screen. I wanted to scream the truth until the glass shattered. I grabbed my phone and called Naomi. I demanded that we hold a press conference right now. I told her I wanted to release the footage of the plate switch and the copy of the forged deed. I wanted to burn Tara's lie to the ground before it could take root. Naomi's voice was calm on the other end of the line. She refused. She explained that if we spoke now, we would just be playing into the frame Tara had built. We would look like the rich, powerful aggressors attacking a defenseless widow. She told me to look at the bigger picture. Tara was lying on national television. She was creating a permanent record of her deceit. Every word she said was being recorded, and every lie was another nail in the case the prosecutor was building. Naomi told me to let her talk, let her hang herself with her own story. I hung up the phone. I looked at the television one last time. Tara was sobbing into her hands, the audience applauding her bravery. I pressed the power button, and the room plunged into darkness. I sat there in the silence, listening to the steady rhythm of my own heart. 1 beat, 2 beats, 3 beats. I did not need the applause of a studio audience. I just needed to stay alive long enough to hear the truth read aloud in a courtroom, where tears and white shirts could not hide the stain of murder. The night the excavator broke the frozen ground at the Maple Ridge Cemetery. I stood outside the perimeter of the blinding floodlights. The wind whipped my grey coat around my legs, but I did not feel the cold. I watched the machinery disturb the peace of my son's grave, and with a hand that trembled from rage rather than age, I signed the authorization papers. I was desecrating his rest to ensure he could finally sleep in peace. The second autopsy report arrived on the desk of the coroner 48 hours later. It was a document of clinical horror. The pathologist confirmed that Matthew's heart showed absolutely no signs of coronary artery disease. There was no blockage, no plaque, no damage consistent with a natural heart attack. Instead, the toxicology screen lit up like a warning flare. His blood and liver tissue contained lethal concentrations of warfarin. It was a common anticoagulant, often used in rat poison. The levels suggested he had not been given one massive dose, but rather small, consistent doses over a period of weeks. The coroner pulled his medical history and found the red flags that everyone had missed. Matthew had gone to urgent care twice for unexplained bruising and bleeding gums. Both times. Tara had been the one to speak to the doctors, dismissing it as fatigue from overworking at the garage. She had talked him to death right in front of the professionals. While the medical evidence was solidifying, Luis Ortega was tightening the net on the financial side. He drove across state lines to the Silver Creek Casino and found Mason Reddick in the VIP lounge. Luis did not play games. He sat down and laid out the situation. He told Mason that the woman who owed him money was about to be charged with murder, and if Mason did not want to be dragged down as an accessory or a co-conspirator in a homicide for hire, he needed to cooperate. Mason was a shark, but he was a businessman. He had no desire to trade his lifestyle for a prison cell over a debt of $200,000. He agreed to wear a wire. The meeting took place in the shadows of a multi-level parking garage near the casino. Luis and I listened from a van parked 3 levels down. The audio feed crackled as Mason cornered Tara against her car. He was aggressive. He demanded his money immediately, or he would take collateral. Tara sounded frantic. She was crying, her voice pitching up in hysteria. Then came the moment that sealed her fate. Mason pushed her, asking why she was stalling if she had the house. In her panic, Tara cracked. Her voice came through the speaker, distorted but undeniable. She screamed that she had already paid the ultimate price. She said she had lost her husband and lost her future. She said she had done everything. She said she even went so far as not stopping when she should have. It was not a direct confession of murder, but combined with the text message about him not being a problem, it was damning. She admitted to a deliberate inaction that led to death. Luis cut the recording and drove straight to the district attorney. The district attorney was a man named David Ross. 30 years ago. He was a brilliant but broke student whose college application fees I had quietly paid through a community fund. He reviewed the file in silence. He looked at the footage of the poison going into the gravy. He read the autopsy report on the warfarin. He listened to the tape from the garage. When he looked up at me, his eyes were wet, but his jaw was set in stone. He promised me that he would pursue the maximum penalty under the law. The judge signed the arrest warrant in the quiet of his chambers. It was done. But David had a specific strategy in mind. He suggested we hold the warrant for 24 hours. He wanted to execute it at the upcoming civil hearing regarding the house. He argued that since Tara had used the media to paint herself as a victim and me as a villain, we should let the public see the truth in the most undeniable setting possible. We would turn her stage into her cell. I agreed. I went back to my hotel room and waited for the sun to rise on Judgment Day. The sky over the Harbourview District Court was the colour of slate, heavy and unforgiving. I walked up the concrete steps in my old black dress, clutching my cane. I moved through a gauntlet of whispers. The hallway was packed with people who had seen Tara on television. I felt their eyes on me. Some looked at me with pity, but many looked at me with open suspicion. To them, I was the villain in a primetime soap opera, the rich mother-in-law who had thrown a grieving widow onto the street. I kept my head high and my eyes forward. I did not need their approval. I only needed their attention for what was about to happen. Inside the courtroom, the air was stifling. Tara sat at the plaintiff's table, dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue. Her lawyer, Dylan Marks, stood up and launched into his opening statement for the civil suit. He repeated the same tired script Tara had fed the media. He spoke of her as a victim of a wealthy, hidden empire. He used phrases like financial duress and emotional cruelty, recycling the exact sound bites that had trended on social media the night before. He looked at the gallery, playing to the audience, trying to win a verdict with sympathy rather than facts. Naomi waited until he was finished. She did not stand up with a flourish. She simply remained seated and opened the leather binder of the Briggs Heritage Trust. She spoke clearly. She presented the deed transfer records dated 10 years ago. She proved, in under 3 minutes, that Matthew had never held the title to the Maple Ridge house. The judge looked at the documents, then at Dylan. He pushed his glasses up his nose and dismissed the civil suit with a wave of his hand, calling it a waste of the court's time. Dylan looked like he had swallowed a lemon. Tara began to panic. She looked around the room, realizing her narrative was crumbling. Naomi stood up then. She asked the judge for 2 minutes to address the court regarding the defamation of her client. The judge granted it. Naomi did not hold back. She listed the forensic evidence of the forged signature. She revealed the existence of the $200,000 gambling debt to Mason Reddick. She revealed the petition for divorce and the new will Matthew had signed just days before his heart stopped. She drew a straight line from Tara's debt to Matthew's death. Tara leapt to her feet. She screamed that it was all lies. She shrieked that we hated her because she was white and poor. She turned to the press gallery, begging for the cameras to believe her, desperate to reclaim her status as the victim. At that exact moment, the double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. The room went deadly silent. The district attorney walked in, flanked by Sergeant Black and Officer Lucas. They were not carrying civil papers. They were carrying a thick criminal file. The district attorney approached the bench and announced that the state was executing an arrest warrant for Tara Briggs on the charge of murder in the 1st degree. He cited the toxicology report confirming long-term warfarin poisoning and the audio confession obtained from the wire worn by Mason Reddick. Then, the screens mounted on the courtroom walls flickered to life. The footage from Thanksgiving played. The entire room watched in horrified silence as Tara pulled the packet of powder from her pocket and dumped it into the gravy. They watched her stir it. Then, they saw the moment that saved my life. They saw me switch the plates. The image of the sainted widow shattered into 1,000,000 pieces. The gasps from the gallery sucked the air out of the room. Officer Lucas moved forward and pulled Tara's hands behind her back. The handcuffs clicked shut with a sound that echoed like a gunshot. Tara was screaming now, thrashing against the restraint. She yelled that I had killed my son. She screamed that I had forced him to write that will. But nobody was listening anymore. The cameras were flashing. capturing the face of a killer. I stood up slowly. I leaned on my cane and looked her in the eyes. I spoke softly, but in the silence, my voice carried to every corner of the room. I told her that the gravy my son made almost killed me. I told her that it was her greed that killed him. I told her that from now on, the silence of a prison cell would be the only dinner she would ever have. I turned my back on her screams. I walked down the center aisle, past the stunned reporters and the gaping onlookers. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the winter air. It was cold and biting, but it was clean. The metallic smell of poison was gone. My son was gone. But the truth was finally breathing. Thank you so much for listening to my story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from, so please drop a comment below and let us chat. If you want to hear more secrets from the past, make sure to subscribe to Grandma's Family Diary. Hit that like button and give this video a hype so we can share the truth with everyone.